A tech commune loses its business license in Johor. 342 foreigners get swept up in an immigration crackdown in Bali. Two different stories, separated by thousands of kilometers but carrying one shared lesson for the entire region. The grey zone of informal foreign work in Southeast Asia is rapidly closing, and the governments of Malaysia and Indonesia are leading the charge. To understand why this is happening now, we have to look past the headlines and examine the actual incentives driving these two booming economies. Act 1. The notice on the door. Our story starts on the 22nd of July. Officers from the Iskandar Puteri City Council walked into Forest City, Johor. They taped a stark closure notice to the entrance of a sprawling facility known as Network School. This was not a minor administrative visit. It was the sudden end to a highly visible experiment in foreign co-working and residential living, placed right on the edge of one of Southeast Asia's most important economic zones. Forest City itself was built on the promise of international integration, but this specific closure sent a very different signal about what the state is willing to accept. Inside that building, the community had hosted hundreds of foreign participants over its run. These were coders, founders, and self-described network state builders. They were living and working together in a shared physical footprint, operating under the assumption that their presence was mutually beneficial. However, they were doing all of this on a business license that, according to the state government, no longer matched what was actually happening inside the building. The gap between the paperwork and the reality on the ground had simply grown too wide to ignore. 3,000 kilometers away, in Bali, a completely different kind of enforcement operation had been running for months. Since mid-April, a 100-officer immigration task force called Dharma Dewata had been walking the streets of popular tourist hubs like Canggu, Ubud, and Seminyak. They were conducting direct checks, comparing passports and visa categories against what foreign visitors were actually doing on their laptops in cafes and co-working spaces. It was a targeted effort to untangle the massive web of informal digital labor that has defined Bali for years. The results of that enforcement effort were staggering. By the end of June, authorities had deported 342 foreign nationals from the island. These individuals hailed from 60 different countries, representing a truly global cross-section of the digital nomad community. Most of them were removed for the exact same basic offense. They were working quietly and informally on a tourist or social visa that never permitted local commercial activity. The era of looking the other way had definitively ended. But here is the contradiction at the heart of this shift. Neither of these enforcement actions represented a blanket ban on foreign involvement in the local economy. In fact, both of these crackdowns happened in countries that were simultaneously chasing and winning some of the largest foreign technology investments in their entire history. They are pushing out small, informal foreign operators while rolling out the red carpet for massive global tech giants. That tension between who gets deported and who gets protected is the real story we need to unpack. Act 2. What the grey zone used to cover. For years, both Malaysia and Indonesia comfortably tolerated a loose, informal category of foreign presence that never quite fit into any existing rulebook. The grey zone was an open secret. In Bali, it was the digital nomad, someone entering on a standard tourist or social visa, technically forbidden from local commercial work. Yet they built full lives and often lucrative businesses on the island, primarily because local enforcement simply did not have the resources or the mandate to reach that far into the cafes of Canggu. In Johor, the grey zone covered something more explicitly experimental. Network School was founded by former Coinbase Chief Technology Officer Balaji Srinivasan. It was built around a grand, futuristic idea that digitally connected communities could construct their own physical footprint, pursuing what they called voluntary alignment with the states hosting them. Spotlight had already been turned on. When scrutiny intensified earlier this year, it was partly driven by allegations regarding some participants' travel documentation. Those specific allegations were later found to be unsubstantiated by Malaysian authorities, but despite the futuristic branding and the initial wave of controversy, what actually ended the venture was far more mundane. Johor's own executive councillor confirmed that the operation's activities had simply diverged from what its original business license permitted. It was a straightforward compliance failure, a bureaucratic mismatch, rather than anything more dramatic or conspiratorial. When a business outgrows its paperwork in a highly regulated zone, the state will eventually step in, regardless of how innovative the underlying philosophy claims to be. Over in Bali, that informal tolerance had also simply run its course. Driven by hard economic realities, officials began pointing to the massive amount of tax revenue generated by informal work that never actually reached the state treasury. Unregulated foreign leasing was pushing rental prices up, while local businesses were being consistently undercut by foreigners working without proper permits. In response, Indonesia introduced a new legal path, the E33G visa, requiring proof of 60,000 US dollars in annual income. For anyone who cannot meet that bar, the alternative is deportation. Act 3. Who gets protected? Here is what makes both of these stories land differently than a standard, straightforward crackdown narrative. As local enforcement tightened on the ground, record amounts of institutional capital kept flowing into both nations. The line between those who face exclusion and those who receive absolute state protection became much harder to ignore. We are watching two separate tracks of foreign engagement operating simultaneously, and the rules of engagement for one track do not apply to the other. Just look at the numbers. 2025 was Malaysia's absolute best year on record for attracting foreign capital. Approved investments reached an astonishing 426.7 billion ringgit. That is an 11% increase from the year before. Out of that massive total, foreign investment alone made up over 200 billion ringgit. It was a historic, unprecedented boom in external funding, happening in the exact same year that Network School lost its license and was forced to close its doors. A massive share of that capital came from exactly the kind of company that a pop-up digital community was never going to become. Oracle committed more than 6.5 billion US dollars to build its very first Malaysian cloud region. Microsoft pledged another 2.2 billion US dollars. Google broke ground on a 2 billion US dollar data center. And Amazon's cloud division committed 6.2 billion US dollars over roughly 14 years. The hyperscalers have firmly arrived in Southeast Asia, and they play by an entirely different set of rules. These enormous tech companies spend years in deep, coordinated discussion with federal investment agencies before a single foundation is ever poured. They navigate complex regulatory frameworks, secure long-term guarantees, and build deep roots within the host nation's economic strategy. That kind of rigorous due diligence is something a rotating community of digital nomads or a temporary co-living campus simply cannot replicate. They never have the scale or the required years of sustained engagement to build that kind of permanent institutional relationship. That is the actual divide. It isn't about nationality or even strictly about legality in the abstract sense. As one geopolitical consultant noted, these multinationals operate on an entirely different scale, possessing an institutional relationship to lean on when scrutiny arrives. When a small, ambiguous, informally structured foreign venture runs into a licensing gap, the state has almost nothing to lose by enforcing the rule as strictly written. But when a hyperscaler is negotiating a data center that will run until 2038, the state's calculation is completely inverted. Act 4. The optimistic path. Looking ahead, there are really only two ways this plays out for the region. The path forward is less about the original intent of the foreign workers and much more about who can successfully adapt to the new rules and who is forced to exit. Southeast Asia is rewriting its terms of engagement, and the transition period is going to create distinct winners and losers depending on how governments choose to balance enforcement with their broader economic ambitions. In the optimistic scenario, this new friction produces something genuinely useful. The informal foreign economy either formalizes through proper licenses and high-tier visas, or it leaves entirely. Meanwhile, the heavy, capital-intensive investments that these governments have spent years courting keep arriving on schedule, totally insulated from the turbulence. If it works, Indonesia's goal of shifting toward quality tourism becomes much easier to defend because the enforcement actually nudges people into legal channels rather than just sweeping them out blindly. But there is a harder version of this story. If this enforcement starts to look selective rather than strictly principled, it could begin to cost these countries the very reputation they are trying so hard to build. Digital nomads represent a global population estimated in the tens of millions, generating real, sustained local spending in whatever community they land in. If the environment becomes too hostile or unpredictable, that mobile economic engine will simply pack up and take its capital elsewhere, leaving empty cafes and vacant rentals behind. We can already see how quickly that capital diverts. Commentary following the Johor closure warned that the episode sent a chilling message to smaller tech ventures, and within days of losing its business license, Network School had already signed a memorandum of understanding with Kazakhstan to explore building its next campus there. If local enforcement reads as arbitrary, the global appetite for experimentation simply shifts to a different jurisdiction that is more willing to play host. The global competition for this specific kind of borderless talent is fierce, and other nations are more than happy to absorb the ventures that Southeast Asia pushes away. Act 5. Landlord or Gatekeeper. What both of these cases actually reveal is not a sudden hostility to foreign involvement, Instead, it is a rapid maturing of exactly how selective these governments have become about which foreign actors get protected and which get penalized. The core question is no longer whether foreigners are welcome in Malaysia and Indonesia. The real question is under what specific terms they are allowed to stay, and whether the host nation sees itself primarily as a passive landlord or an active gatekeeper to its own economy. If a venture can commit to a decade of hard infrastructure, coordinate directly with federal ministries, and comfortably absorb years of due diligence, it gets the absolute red carpet treatment. It becomes a protected partner in the nation's growth. But if a venture operates mostly on trust, relies on informal arrangements, and uses ambiguous branding, it is entirely exposed. It gets whatever interpretation of the law the smallest local authority decides to strictly enforce on any given week. Neither Malaysia nor Indonesia has closed itself off from the rest of the world. They are still open for business, but they have simply decided in their own unique ways and on their own timelines to change the price of admission. Both nations have calculated exactly how much institutional weight a foreign presence needs to carry before the state is willing to extend it real, meaningful protection against local scrutiny and regulatory friction. The days of operating under the radar, assuming that a tourist visa or a vague business license will shield you indefinitely, are effectively over. Somewhere between a Bali beach bar and a Kuala Lumpur data center sits the actual unspoken threshold. Every single foreign operator now arriving in Southeast Asia is being carefully measured against it, whether they know it or not. The gray zone that allowed informal networks to thrive for years is finally closing. The rigid clarity that replaces it will permanently reshape who gets to build the next chapter of the region's digital economy and who is simply asked to leave. The ASEAN angle covers Southeast Asia's biggest economic and policy stories, clearly independently without the noise. I am Hero the Hornbill, and this is the ASEAN angle. If this episode gave you a new way of seeing the region, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. New episodes weekly, link in the description.